Hey everyone, how are we doing? Welcome back to a novel review book podcast. My name is Seamus and I'm the host, and if this is your first time joining me, then thank you so much for clicking on. I really hope you enjoy the show. I hope you enjoy the book today. If you're a returning customer, thank you so much for coming back. I hope you also enjoy the book today. And today's book is a big one. Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell by Susanna Clarke, coming in at just over 1,000 pages long, 1,006 to be precise in this edition. This was a fantastic book. I had a great time reading this book. I'll get to that in a second. First, I just want to say I hope we're all well. It is still January. It's currently raining here in London. It's a cold, wet, blustery day. I'm nice and cozy inside, thankfully, so I hope you guys are well wherever you are, and I hope you're reading some really good books. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate that. If you'd like to click the duck in the corner, if you'd like to click follow if you're on traditional podcast platforms and you are listening to me through your ears, then yes, please click follow or a 5-star review. That's really great. But as always, just I hope you enjoy the show. I hope you have fun. It is a free podcast, so just sit back and have a bit of fun. Okay, on to today's book, Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell. This was a really great book. I first just want to preface though, if I do make a mistake with the title, I have been struggling with the title ever since I first saw the book. For some reason, even in my notes here, I wrote it down as The Strange Case of Jonathan Norrell and Dr. Hyde. And I think I'm definitely just combining here The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I have no idea why. I think it's just a combination of two names and the two Misters in there as well. So if I do make that mistake, I am terribly sorry. I'm not doing it on purpose or trying to take the piss out of anyone. For some reason, and no matter how many times I look at the book and the cover, I just can't seem to separate the two. I don't know why. So if I do make the mistake throughout the episode, please do forgive me. But it was a fantastic book. I was honestly a bit nervous coming into it, I guess, because I read Piranesi last year and I absolutely loved Piranesi, and I thought it was probably the second best book I read last year outside of Small Things Like These. So jumping into the only other book she's written with Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell, I know she has written some short stories, which I may also jump into as well. But jumping into the only other novel she's written, I think I was quite nervous about how this was going to stack up against Piranesi. I know Piranesi did come second. This one did come first. But I was just kind of nervous, I guess. And Piranesi is quite a short book as well. It must only be 250 pages. Whereas this one, is pretty much 4 times that at 1,000 pages. So very different kinds of stories, very different lengths of stories. So I was just kind of a bit worried about how it was going to stack up against that. I mean, you shouldn't really be comparing them, but naturally, when you've read a book as good as Piranesi, you want to be following up with a book that is just as good as that. So I was quite nervous, and to put it quite simply, I didn't need to be. This book was really, really fantastic, although I have read a lot of comments. Whenever I finish a book, I like to go to primarily Goodreads and sort of read what other people thought. And it seems to be that a lot of people either loved this or hated this. And I do think that's quite interesting because it is I'd say it's a very slow burn of a story, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy long books for one, big books that you can sink your teeth into and get really lost in the world, but also slow burn books. And I think I've transitioned as I've got older, and I don't think it's necessarily an age thing, but I think I've just sort of transitioned to more, I guess, dialogue heavy books and story driven books rather than sort of the big flashy kind of action sequences. There are still some quite exciting scenes in this, but it does feel a lot more of a slow burn. So I think that's probably why a lot of people don't like it. Some people, or quite a few people, said, not enough bang for your buck kind of thing, or not enough reward at the end for the effort you put in. But I completely disagree. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic fantasy novel. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic novel in its own regard. Start to finish, I was engaged. I thought the story itself was also very, very complete. It all felt incredibly natural and came to a really tight, nice end that didn't feel rushed or out of place or unreasonable or anything like that. So they're sort of my initial thoughts. I've kind of just jumped straight in, haven't I? I haven't even done an overview. To put it simply, it is a fantasy novel, but it does take place sort of in an alternate universe to our world. And I'd say that, they're living in London. It's the 19th century. There's a battle between France and England, and Napoleon's there. So it's very kind of speculative history if there was just our current history, but with magicians involved. There are magicians, but they're all called theoretical magicians. For the first 50 pages of the book, we're sort of hanging out with them until we meet Mr. Norrell, who is the only practising magician. And he's a really kind of interesting character in that he's not very loud and over the top. He's not very flamboyant. He's a bit of a boring character. He loves to read and collect books on magic to a fault. So there's kind of him. And then a bit later in the book, we meet Jonathan Strange, who becomes Mr. Norrell's student. And he becomes the second practising magician. And it then becomes this kind of story about how do they interact. Jonathan Strange is young. He's energetic. He's ambitious. He wants to change the world in certain ways. And he's just very different to Mr. Norrell. And it becomes about their kind of relationship and how they navigate that, because they're both very ambitious people, but their ambitions are very differing kinds of ambitions. So it's about that. And it's kind of the classic, teacher, student wants to be better than the teacher. Teacher doesn't really want them to become better, because if they're better than they are. So it's all that kind of drama as well. Throw in the war with Napoleon in there as well, and then you've got a fairy in there as well, causing absolute havoc. A few other magicians in there, and it's just this huge, great fantasy story. And I think what I really loved about it is, I think fantasy can be quite frightening if you're not a fantasy lover, and it can be quite frightening because you look at things like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, or the Malazan series, Book of the Fallen, anything by Brandon Sanderson, George R. R. Martin, even the Harry Potters, they're all multi-book series. There's not many that I know of, at least, and if there are any, please let me know. But sort of one done fantasy books where it's like you start and you finish in one book in this fantasy world. So that's what I absolutely loved about it, because it's a fantasy book in one book. You don't have to dip into Wheel of Time, I think, is 14 books long, that kind of thing. So it's nice to just sort of dip your toe in for one book and then be out, and then be able to move on to something else. You can obviously go to another fantasy series if you want, but it's nice to not feel I have to commit to 14 books of a fantasy series, which is really, really nice. So one of the things I really loved about this story was this idea of ambition, because Mr. Norrell's really ambitious and Jonathan Strange is really ambitious. And like I said, they're ambitious in different kind of ways. So quite early in the story, Mr. Norrell is ambitious to sort of get his name out there and let people know that he is the only practising magician. And he summons a fairy to help him with some magic. And this fairy is known, and I've written it down just to make sure, the gentleman with the thistle down hair. And he sort of helps Mr. Norrell perform this magic. And then Mr. Norrell sort of goes about his business, and then this gentleman with the thistle down hair just sort of starts to wreak havoc upon the world, but really quietly, and he's sort of influencing the story in different ways throughout the entirety of the story, until the point that he becomes probably one of the chief villains of this story. And he's a really, really frightening villain, I think, and I really loved him as a villain. And I know I started this point talking about the ambition of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but I've now pivoted to the gentleman with the thistle down hair. He's a really fantastic villain in that he's this kind of like this benevolent villain that I think is benevolent to a fault, and it's the point where benevolence becomes, or the blindness to your own benevolence becomes, a real kind of traumatic, I guess, issue, and you're actually doing a lot more harm than you are doing good through that idea of benevolence and thinking that you're good and doing good things with good intentions, but it's actually causing a lot of havoc. And it's these really kind of frightening scenes, I think, for those reasons. But getting back, so Mr. Norrell's really ambitious, and he's really ambitious that he wants to get his name out there, and he wants to sort of be known as this practising magician. But the thing is, he doesn't really want anyone else to be a magician. He kind of has this idea of socializing magic back in England because it's lost their magical roots through time and history. And he's got this idea of re-socializing magic, but he also purchases every book that's ever been produced about magic and hoards them away in his libraries, and he doesn't really want anyone else to see it. And at first you don't really realize it, I don't think, but then you meet Jonathan Strange and he comes in, and Mr. Norrell takes him on as a young apprentice magician, and you realize that Mr. Norrell, and it's kind of a bit of a social commentary here, Mr. Norrell is only sort of giving him certain books on magic and isn't showing him the full story and isn't giving him the full scope. And it's through that ambition that we start to see that Mr. Norrell's ambition is probably a bit problematic, because he's withholding certain pieces of information and magic that he doesn't want Jonathan Strange to see. And it's you think it's partly from a position of, Mr. Norrell not wanting Jonathan to get too much information and I guess become more powerful than Mr. Norrell, but it's also this kind of idea, and it's sort of unspoken about, well, what are you covering up? Like, what have you read in these books that you're covering up that you don't want to now divulge and socialize? Like, is this all a scam? Is this all a lie? Are you really a magician? Do we know this for certain? And it's all these kind of questions, and I guess the social commentary comes in that it's, history is written by the winners, and in this situation, Mr. Norrell is currently the winner. He holds all the information about magic, and he gets to socialize what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. So I thought he was a really interesting character for that. And Jonathan Strange as well, just like incredibly ambitious, and that he's young and he's developed this magical skill. And he doesn't want to be an apprentice, really. He doesn't want to be the apprentice of this fuddy-duddy old guy that loves to just read books all day. He wants to get out there and practice magic. He wants to explore the darker aspects of magic. He wants to push the boundaries of magic, and he really wants to socialize it in that way. So it's kind of like, it's all these wonderful characters, I guess, and that was, for me, one of the strong points of this book, is all the characters were incredibly well fleshed out and sort of played off each other really well. But it's understanding how all these characters, Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell, the gentleman with the thistle down here, how none of them are particularly good. Some of them are a bit worse than others, but like they're all just felt incredibly human, even though they're magicians and magical in some way. But it's these kind of like, they all had gray areas that I thought were really, really well explored. Really, yeah, I guess so. So that was like a really strong point for me. I think I've just gone on like an absolute sort of monologue that has jumped around a lot, so I apologize for that. I really should just stick to my notes and let them guide me instead of going on these giantly long, look at me, I can't even say proper words now. Footnotes. Let's talk about the footnotes. So the book is written like this kind of history book, and that's kind of like, I think one of the great humors of it. It is written like this kind of alternative history book, and there are footnotes all through it. And they're lovely. They're absolutely fantastic. I mean, some people didn't like them. I found them really fascinating and interesting. My only criticism of the footnotes is that I'd be kind of reading a page, and I'd be so engrossed in that particular page that I would miss the footnote reference. And then I'd get to the bottom of the page and I'd see that there's a footnote to read, and I'd have to go back and try find that particular paragraph and then re-understand what was being explored in that particular scene, in that particular moment, so that the footnote then makes sense. Other than that, it was absolutely fantastic. I think Susanna Clarke is just a wonderful storyteller. There was one footnote that I think was like 8 or 9 pages long. So it's like a mini story within the story. And it was just these like really kind of like charming aspects to the story that I really loved. Something else I really loved, and I think we should bring back more of, because it's also in the fantasy series that I'm doing for January, February, March, the Gormenghast trilogy, is sketched pictures throughout the story. It's just kind of like, it's not very often, maybe one every 50, 60, 70 pages. And it's just such a nice little treat, isn't it? When you get a page of a sketch, and you just get to look at it and see that scene, and you kind of wonder, why did you pick that scene to sketch? Why here? Why now? What's special about this scene? Is there anything special about this scene? And I think I just love it for that reason, that it is often just quite random, but you do just get like a little break in text to see this sort of imagining of what the scene should look like. And I just love that. I thought it was really, really beautiful. Something else I learned within this book was this other character that Jonathan Strange starts to help in the war against Napoleon, is this guy called Lord Wellington. And one of the comments about it was like, it's fascinating. One of the comments that I read about someone commenting on the book was this guy saying it's fascinating how some people don't know who Lord Wellington is. And I'm one of those people. I didn't know, and I still don't really know who Lord Wellington is. Apparently, he's one of England's sort of greatest ever generals. Obviously, he did a fantastic job leading England against Napoleon. Actually, I say that. I don't actually know, because I don't know too much about that period, which is actually what led me to buy this book, Andrew Roberts' Napoleon the Great, because Napoleon just seems to be this character that keeps popping up. I mean, I know he's considered, a great general, but he's this character that just keeps popping up. Like, he's in the Count of Monte Cristo. There's some references to him in that. He's in War and Peace. He's now in this book. Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell. He just seems to be popping up as a character or as a reference to these great stories that I seem to really love. And I don't really know much about that particular period, because it's a particular period I've never learnt about and I wouldn't say never had an interest to go check out, but I've just always naturally been concerned with ancient history. If this is your first time joining me, I have a background in ancient history. So I've decided to sort of read a bit about that. But this whole thing was, this guy was like, can't believe no one, like some people don't know who Lord Wellington is. And I'm like, well, I grew up in Australia. We didn't learn English history, and sort of, England fighting France in the Napoleonic Wars wasn't part of our history curriculum. It was more sort of Australian based, and the relationship between the English and the Indigenous Australians. So I didn't know who he was. I now roughly know who he was. Not enough to say anything of, concrete, nothing concrete about him, but that's okay. Hopefully I'll learn a bit more about him in this book over here, which I want to start reading very, very soon. So I found that really interesting because it did feel like I was then also learning something as well, which is always very fun. The genre of this book is very, very interesting. I wrote down a few different things. Is it gothic literature? Is it historical? Is it fantasy? Is it social commentary? Is it a comedy? Because it's sly, it's witty, it's deep, it's rich, it's complete. Yes, it is complete, very complete. It's simple, it's really nice. It's the tonal landscape view of the world. Oh my goodness. The writing style in this book, I'd say, is absolutely fantastic. I mean, there's no pieces, I didn't think there was any sort of pieces within this story where I was like, oh wow, that chapter's or that paragraph has blown me away in terms of like changing my life, and that's like really, really quotable. I didn't think there was anything like that, but I don't think it's really the kind of story to have that. But the story itself, the storytelling, the writing, I mean, you could visualize every scene with wonderful accuracy, and the story itself was just, I thought, so beautiful. And like I wrote there, the tonal landscape view of the world was really, really complete. I knew where I was at every point in this story. I knew what I was visualizing. I knew what Susanna Clarke was wanting me to visualize in that scene. It felt incredibly vivid and rich, and I thought the writing style was incredibly simple and beautiful and effective and emotive, and really sort of carried the story quite literally, because that's the nature of books. I also found it really interesting reading this story because this was released in 2004, and Piranesi was released in 2020, I believe it was. And I found it really fascinating to see elements of Piranesi in here, sort of long halls and labyrinth-like halls and the labyrinth networks. And I mean, even here on page 698, Susanna Clarke does make a reference to, like the works of Palladio and Piranesi, but they cannot help us, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like, she seems to have this really nice fascination with this kind of weird, wonderful idea of fantasy, and it intersecting with our own reality and Piranesi and labyrinthine ways, and I really, really enjoy that. I mean, I'm almost sad. I'm not almost sad. I'm incredibly sad that I've finished the book now because, like I said, this was written and released in 2004. Piranesi was released some 16 years later. It's the kind of writing and books and like kind of quality of writing and books that you say, I'm happy if she releases one book every 16 years because you know it's going to be a really great story, and you know the love and attention to detail is really going to be there. And I probably would have said that before I've read this. And now that I've read this, I'm like, no, I want more now. Please. I just want some more, Susanna. Please just give us more. I thought the story was very different. It was stylistic. It was very, very uncertain. The storyline was very uncertain. For a lot of the story, I didn't know where this story was actually going. And I think that's really enjoyable in a story like this because it does have those kind of elements where you can feel connected to the text, in that it's a young student trying to be better than their teacher and the ambition and involved in that. So it does have elements that you can sort of connect with and that are quite, I guess, common. But then the story itself was just completely uncommon as well. And I think that really helps with the story and creates this sort of mystery about the story that keeps you reading. It was an incredibly fresh, exciting novel. It took many twists and turns. It didn't feel rushed. It didn't feel overwritten. If anything, it was underwritten. I could have easily read another 200 pages of it. I love the story. I could praise it for a long time. I'm definitely going to reread it again. Let's say that. I'm definitely putting it on my reread list, on my retirement list to reread again. What would I rate this out of 5? Pretty high. I'm going to say like a 4.6, I think, because I really enjoyed it. If you have read it, let me know, because like I said, some people really loved it and some people really hated it, and some people DNF'd it, some people praise it. So it's really interesting when you get a book like that is so kind of like there's no one that seems to just sort of go down the middle and say, yeah, it was fine. But some people like really, really love it or really, really hate it. I feel quite fortunate in that I really, really loved it because, why would you not love that? So Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell, Susanna Clarke, absolutely fantastic book, 4.6 out of 5. Check it out if you haven't. I would definitely recommend it. So what am I reading this week? Well, this week I actually started listening to a new book. It is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. Very interesting book. Very interesting book. I'm not too far into it, to be fair. I think I'm 2 hours in and I think it was 16 hours long. Taken a completely different turn to the way in which I thought the story was going. It's actually about two brothers and their sort of, I guess it's going to be about the reaction to their father passing away and how they sort of navigate that and interact with each other. Really interesting story so far. I've never read any Sally Rooney before, so I am quite enjoying seeing what all the hype is about because I know she is quite a famed author and she has like quite a nice following, and there's obviously been some TV shows that have been made from her books as well. So I'm really enjoying it actually. Yeah, I mean, there's not much more to say than that really. I'm interested to see where the story goes. The brothers, one is about 33, I think it is, and the other is 22. So there's a bit of a disconnect there in ages as well. Their father has died, so I'm sort of, I don't want to say I'm loving it, but I'm enjoying the tension that is brewing between them. Obviously, there's the tension of being quite different in ages. They seem to be quite different people on an individual level, and then of course the tension of their father dying and how they react to that. So I think it's like it's building as this very, I guess, a melting pot of trauma and dealing with situations that are going to be perhaps arise some conflicting opinions on certain things. So I don't know where it's going. I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know how the story's going to pan out, but I'm quite enjoying it so far. I quite like the narrator as well. He's this nice Irish guy. So yeah, I'm enjoying that so far. It's really good. I'll let you know how I go with that. But for now, I think it's time to end this episode. But first I should say, if you have gotten this far, please do like and subscribe. All that nonsense. But as always, just thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for tuning in and for listening and for trusting me with a dodgy review and for giving me 20, 30 minutes of your time. I really do appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you'd like to. But as always, just thank you so much for listening. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today, to take us away, a quote from Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell. And this is why I said it's kind of like a comedy, because there is sort of this like humor to the story. And I think this kind of captures it. A humor that's not like overt humor, but humor that sort of comes out in the way that the story was written. He hardly ever spoke of magic, and when he did, it was like a history lesson and no one could bear to listen to him.